Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on performance measurement reporting. This webinar is co-hosted by the National Congress of American Indians Fund, the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and First Pick Incorporated. My name is Esther Labrado, and I'm an enrolled citizen of the North Fork Rancheria of Mono Indians and a descendant of the Morongo Band of Mission Indians, and I'm a staff attorney at NCAI. Before we begin, we'll go ahead and go over some housekeeping tips just to make sure everyone knows how to participate in today's webinar. So on your screen, you can see the PowerPoint presentation, and then to the right of that display is your control panel, and it should look like what's on the screen. If you don't see it, go ahead and click on that small orange arrow, and that will open the control panel for you. At the top of the control panel are your audio controls, and go ahead and you can choose between calling in by phone or listening through your computer. And if you do want to call in by phone, you'll need to click the little bullet next to use telephone for it to display the call-in number and the PIN that you need to use. Below that is your questions box, and that's where you can go ahead and type in any questions you have for the panelists. You can also pose your questions through the raise your hand feature, which is the little icon underneath that orange arrow, which has a raised hand with a little green arrow pointing upwards. If you click on that, we'll see it and we'll be able to unmute your line so you can pose your question out loud. And please feel free to pose questions throughout the presentation. We'll be monitoring that box and then also taking questions at the end. And then I also want to mention today's webinar is being recorded. And after the webinar, you will receive a survey so we can go ahead and complete our evaluation would be really helpful. And then the recorded webinar will be available afterwards, both on the online reporting site, which all of you should be intimately familiar with at this point. And then it will also be on the tribalvictimservices.org technical assistance page. And then I also want to mention that we do have a few handouts for today's webinar. They're in your handouts box in that control panel. We have a PowerPoint with the PDF of the PowerPoint, and then also 2 Excel spreadsheets, which we will be walking through on today's webinar. Next slide, please. Thank you. So again, I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today we're going to be walking through some of the reporting requirements under this microgrant program. And we'll walk through, so you essentially have 2 separate reporting requirements. One is a sort of programmatic reporting requirement, and one is a financial reporting requirement. So today we're focusing on the programmatic side, and that will cover just the information and data that you'll need to be collecting and submitting on a quarterly basis. And we'll include a list of the report due dates later in the webinar, and that information is also in your letter of agreement. I know some folks have successfully navigated the budget approval process and have their LOAs. Others are still working through their budget process. Thank you so much for your patience and working with all of us, especially our partners at First Pick, as we get those processed and get everyone up and running. So as I mentioned, we'll be covering those reporting requirements. And the way that we talk about it, and as we'll explain, is that these reporting requirements come from the Department of Justice's Office for Victims of Crime. Again, this is a federal funding stream, and so we are required to still complete all of those requirements that OVC has in place. So we'll be walking through that today. And then importantly, we want to talk through how to be collecting all of this information and reporting it with always keeping victim safety in mind. So on our last webinar, we covered confidentiality. We'll be touching on that again in this webinar, and we just encourage you to, if you have any questions, please reach out and always go back to that other webinar to get more information about how to keep victim safety and confidentiality kind of at the forefront. So with that, I'll introduce our panelists. Today we have Lana Hunter, Tribal Victim Resource Specialist with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and Kelly Crow, Project Director with First Pick. And I will turn it over to Lana. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Hamatakiapie, Lana Hunter Makiapie, Sasitawan Wakbetawan Mataha. My name is Lana Hunter, and I'm a Tribal Victim Resource Specialist with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and we're honored to be partnering with the National Congress of American Indians as well as First Pick to bring technical assistance to the aspect of funding and understanding the critical access that many tribes may need in terms of financial technical assistance or victim services, programmatic technical assistance. So today we're focusing on, as Esther mentioned, the programmatic side. And we wanted to share with you the information. Hopefully it's very, dense information, but if you can take a moment, we will be referencing the Victim Assistance Subgrantee Data template, which is located in the handout section. So we'll be talking through that a little bit through about halfway through the webinar. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the information, as Esther mentioned, this is through the Office of Victims of Crime. However, throughout the Department of Justice, there is information that is required from all programs. So this would include any tribal programming, any programming within states, state agencies, as well as county agencies who receive Department of Justice funding. And so this was established in 1993 to look at a framework that would allow for basically a uniform reporting requirement across programs. And this would allow for the federal government and federal agencies to really look at the priorities, where the gaps in services are, and to understand where funding may need to be put in, as well as focusing on any policy that may need to be updated, as well as any management assistance, which would include technical assistance. So this is why the information that we are requesting from you today through the National Congress of American Indians, that this is going to be able to help to tell the story of what's happening in Indian country through the microgrant fund, but this will add to the larger story of victims across the country. Next slide. So when we talk about the performance measurement, this is the qualitative and quantitative data that we're going to collect. So when we talk about data, it really kind of goes into that research mode, but really what we're talking about is telling a story. So we're telling a story about what's happening in Indian country. We're counting numbers. We're also telling and sharing success stories of what's happening, what we've been able to do with the funds, what this has allowed us to, start to look at within our communities to begin to assist victims in a way that is meaningful, that is safe, and as Esther mentioned, confidential as well. That's kind of one of the specifics around when we start collecting data for victims of crime. That is probably one of the most central focuses for us to be able to tell this story, is that it does not display, show, or demonstrate any personal identifying information. And so one of the ways that we are going to be utilizing this data, as well as for yourself, is to understand maybe recent trends that have occurred. Some folks have been hard impacted by COVID-19. This would include anything from casinos not being able to operate during COVID, at the height of COVID, or depending on your specific state, you may still be impacted greatly. We want to understand what's happening for you and your community. I know that many communities in California recently experienced wildfires, and so we want to be able to understand how that has impacted victims. So this will be an opportunity for you to tell that story of what's happening in Indian country as it relates to this microgrant fund and how we can best assist you moving forward. And that could be through technical assistance. It could be through, gaps in safety. Maybe we're not able to meet victims of crimes needs. And so what would that look like if we were able to meet the needs? So this is really to tell that story of what's happening for your community. Next slide. So when we think about this is not just data for the federal government or the National Congress of American Indians. This is not data that is exclusive to what we're giving to the federal government to utilize. This is also data that you can utilize within your program. So subgrantees, as we mentioned in this throughout this presentation, that would be you, folks on the ground doing this work. You are able to utilize this data for strategic planning in the future, either by evaluating past performance, setting reasonable goals, objectives, and targets for future awards. So this is allowing you to tell a story with that data for future opportunities for funding, but as well as to understand within your community where you may be able to best meet the needs of victims, to understand the needs of victims, and to really prioritize the needs of victims. Next slide. So when we think about confidentiality and reporting, and thank you for those folks who joined us for our last webinar, which focused exclusively on confidentiality, one of the understandings that we have when we work with the Department of Justice is to understand that they will always protect the victim's identity. They will not require you to produce any personal identifying information regarding victims of crime. And this is for many reasons, but the primary reason is for safety. And so they want to ensure that the funds that you are utilizing will also carry out the expressed goals as well as the intentions for the Department of Justice, which is to protect the confidentiality, private data, personal identifying information with the microgrant fund. Next slide. So the confidentiality and reporting requirements. So this is where the two intersect. And as I mentioned, NCAI, who is the administrator for this grant, microgrant, through the Department of Justice or Office of Victims of Crime, will never ask for any information. And so personal identifying information. We are asking you to collect the aggregate data, which would be minus any personal identifying information. And so with that express goal, we're asking for you, the subgrantees, to protect the confidentiality of the victims' names. This is all personal identifying information, addresses, phone numbers, other information such as social security numbers, their children's names, birth dates, any information that would be able to identify a victim in your community, as well as understanding that you are going to be submitting quarterly reports. So we're going to walk through this performance measurement data requirements to demonstrate that you are utilizing this funding to serve victims of crime, again, minus the personal identifying information. And we would like for you to consider developing an internal control of how the funding is spent, what resources or referrals are provided by advocates, any transportation mileage to and from courts, hospitals, for victims of crime. And understanding that this information can be done without supplying a victim's name, again, any personal identifying information, but to develop those controls so that in the future, once this grant has completed, if there is ever a time that, the federal government may come back and ask how you arrived at this information, how you arrived at the numbers of victims that you served, that you have some internal process that you have developed through your tribe. Again, keeping in mind victims' confidentiality and understanding how to keep that information confidential. And we'll talk through just a couple points on that as well. Next slide. So a sample of the data template for internal control was supplied to us by the Office of Victims of Crime. And so you'll see that it is the the Victim Assistance Subgrantee Data Template. That is the handout that is supplied with the handouts that we've included on today's webinar. But this information is going to consider developing your program's internal tracking mechanism. So this is a template that you can use within your program. You don't have to, but understand that this is some of the information that you will be required to report on in your quarterly reports as well as your final report. So this is not a requirement for you to utilize. And again, this is a sample or a template that's supplied by the Office of Victims of Crime, and it's for you to develop an internal tracking system to understand the data that will be collected. However, it is not required. So if there is another internal process, internal control that you have within your tribe to keep information regarding the reporting requirements that you have developed, that you want to develop, please feel free to do that. But this at least provides you the information that you will be reporting on. And we're going to walk through that template today. So what can this internal tracking mechanism look like? So this is the pieces of that template we're going to walk through, but specifically, again, to understand that some of this information, you can develop your own internal process, but again, it comes with understanding victim confidentiality and how to keep that information safe. Next slide. So this is a specific around asking for population demographics. And we understand that not all programs are going to require maybe specific demographic information. And so we want you to understand that we get that entirely. So we want to be able to develop a process of how we arrive at that information. And so this is the section that we'll be focusing on in the next few slides. So if you can refer to your own template, we actually have this information included in that demographic. So it will be in population demographics in your sample template. Next slide. So as we focused on confidentiality, one of the things that we want to understand is if you look in the specific section of the template where it says, I believe it is section Victim Assistance Data Tracking in Quarter 1. Located under that, there is a space for an individual ID. And so this is where that critical confidentiality requirements and understanding victims' confidentiality is really going to be critical to keep that information secure and safe. So while you may utilize this data template, we want you to protect the identity of a victim. So you can assign, numbers to identify a victim, and this would be her, separate from her name or any personal identifying information. And so in the data template that we've included, we have developed, I believe, flowers as the identifying information for that's assigned to a victim, but does not display any of her personal identifying information. So in our sample template, we have 4 names, and those are all representative of flowers, but you can use anything. You can use something in your language. You can use a succession of numbers. You could use your tribe with a number that correlates to a victim that you've served. The only caution is to keep this information safe. So your expressed goal, your expressed, as well as through the Department of Justice, is to keep victims' personal identifying information safe. And so if you have a key code that identifies, who a victim is on the anonymous sheet, that information that displays the victim's name or any personal identifying information, we just ask, and some of the best practices is to keep a key code or documentation separate from the internal reporting document so that someone could not find, the actual name of the victim and correlate it back to the chart or the internal control document that you have developed. And this is, again, just to ensure the victim's confidentiality. And then, additional safety measures or safety precautions is to keep it on a password protected computer in a locked cabinet. And we also recommend not keeping that information online that would identify a victim that correlates to those numbers, succession of letters, or however you would identify that victim, that information not be kept online. And the reason for this is any cyber hacking, that information becomes vulnerable. So we just ask that you keep it maybe in a folder that's located on a computer with limited access by 1 to 2 employees. And again, this is to protect the victim's confidentiality, her identity, and to understand that the reporting requirements are going to tell a large story about what has happened to that victim, and that information either being out in the community or potentially being hacked, and being able to identify that victim can pose a number of safety risks for that victim. Next slide. So as we go into the specifics around what information that we are going to be collecting, and understanding that there are specific requirements that we are asked to, again, require from you as subgrantees, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kelly.
Thank you, Mona. So just as a reminder, going back to, and if you want to look at your template, you'll notice that the tabs are broken down into quarters. We are, and OVC is asking that we report on data on a quarterly basis. So there is a different tab for each quarter of the year. And as the quarter changes, you'll move to the next tab and start entering new information. Because you're going to be doing that, entering new information for each quarter, OVC has set up a way to identify, make sure that you're not double counting individuals so that they can get a clear sense of how many unique individuals are served by your program. So the way that that's done is if you look at your template, there's columns to indicate if somebody is a new individual, if they're an anonymous contact, or if they're a continuing individual. The first thing I'll note, and it says here in the first bullet, is that in your first report, all victims are going to be considered new individuals, even if you've previously served that individual through your agency. And this is because they're new to the grant. So in the very first quarter of your grant, these folks, all of the individuals that you serve will be considered new individuals. Going on from that, after the first quarter, if you have the capability, will be tracking who is a new individual versus who is a continuing individual. And that just means that if you served somebody in quarter one, and then they returned for services in quarter two or in quarter four or quarter seven, that person is now considered a continuing individual on your grant as opposed to a new individual. And again, this is just to make sure that they don't double count individuals, and they can get a clear sense of the total number of individuals that you served. The third category that they have here is anonymous contacts. And this is because some of you may be providing services through a hotline or online chat where you don't know if this individual is new or if they've been to your facility or to your agency before. And so there's going to be a way to note who that person is, or that you provided services to them without expecting that you're asking for any information about them that would indicate if they are a new or continuing individual. Next slide, please.
Kelly, I want to interject real quickly. We got a very good question in the chat box, and it was, is there an expectation of providing information if the tribe does not currently provide services? And I'll go ahead and I'll include the response and send it out to everyone as well. But I did want to kind of help answer that of yes, you will be required to complete a report every quarter, even if you're not yet providing services. And in that case, you would just enter zeros. And I think I'll defer to Kelly on this, but we will have a later webinar closer to the time when you'll actually have to be reporting. And will walk you through how to actually enter this information in the online reporting system. So great question. And I think we can make sure that we cover that piece in that later training and when we're actually helping you enter the information. But Kelly, did you have anything, or Lana, anything else to add?
I would just reiterate that we know there's a lot of tribes that are going to be doing strategic planning or needs assessments at the beginning of their programs before they begin direct services. And so to Esther's point, we will ask you to complete a report because there are going to be some narrative questions that will help us understand your progress along those activities. But as Esther mentioned, we'll walk you through kind of how to complete the data portion of the report just to indicate that you're not serving individuals yet or at this point. Lana,
and then we did get a.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Lana.
Oh, I think that was Kelly.
Oh, great. Okay, great. And then we did get another question, which actually is a little bit of a tech logistics one, so I will respond to that offline. But sorry, go ahead, Kelly. Thank you.
Okay. So again, this is going to reiterate the fact that when you are entering your information, can you, Abby, go back to the previous slide real quick? I just want to show what we've done here. If you notice the three bullet points here, new individual, anonymous individual, and continuing individual, match the let's see, it's row 3, B, C, and D. However, this spreadsheet is built out so that it's going to automatically calculate the numbers that you then have to enter into the report on the reporting site. So you're responsible for entering the new individuals, anonymous contacts, or continuing individuals, or to Londa's point, you're tracking that information through your own internal controls process that you have. When you go to enter the information into the online reporting system, and Abby, we can move forward now, the first question that you're going to be asked, next slide. The first question you're going to be asked is the total number of individuals who received services during the reporting period. So again, if you're using this template, it automatically calculates that for you, and it's down under rows like 19 through 22. You'll see that it provides that calculation, but if you're doing the tracking through a different mechanism, you would just indicate the total number. You do not count anonymous contacts in this. And this is so that we make sure that there is an unduplicated total number of victims served, regardless of the crime or the type. So I'm going to pass it back over to Lana so that she can share a little bit about the example, and we can kind of, you can picture how this might work with one individual.
Wonderful. Thank you, Abby. If we could pull up, and folks on the webinar, if you could pull up the Victim Assistance Subgrantee Data Template. We're going to go through that, and we're going to talk a little bit about just what this can look like on this report, but to understand that this information that you are recording in this template, again, you can organize it to however it fits best for your tribe, but this is essentially the questions that you will be asked to report on. So if we have that up. So as we explained within the sample template, if you look over to the first section, we have rose, lily, daisy, tulip. So these are sub or, just anonymous names that correlate to a victim of crime. And so we'll go through the example of Rose. And so as I laid out on the previous slide, so Rose is a new individual because she has not been served at any point. This is a new reporting process. So again, we're going to put her in that first category under new individual. Rose is from your tribal community. She's American Indian. And so these are the classifications that they would be classified in. So American Indian, Alaska Native, you would check or put a 1 in that category to tell that story of who that victim is. And if you go through the next process, there are other categories of race. So you can see Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino, and then there's a place for multiple races. So say you have someone who's biracial, they're from your tribe, but maybe their father is non-native. There's a category for how they identify. Go to the next section. So we have marked female. Again, this is demographic information. So we are really looking at who this individual is, how old they are, male, female. And again, if your program does not track demographic information, do not try to develop something if it feels inauthentic, but really to understand that we're trying to understand who your program is serving. And if you are not serving victims because you're still in the process of setting up your program, you don't have to worry about these sections. So Rose is between the ages of 18 to 24, and that's the age category. And so when we think about what has happened to Rose throughout her lifetime, so if you have a victim who has expressed, that they were a victim of sexual assault, Rose was victimized outside of the casino. She was a victim of burglary. Someone had taken her purse. At the time, she was sexually assaulted, but also she was under duress for some period of time due to not just the current victimization, but because she was also an adult victim of child sexual abuse. So this triggered her own victimization that she experienced as a child. So if you understand this information from the victim, this is not information that you are going to be asking her. Again, you are an advocate, or you're in that position to understand what she wants you or what he wants you to understand. So she has disclosed that she was an adult a victim of sexual assault, and then she also displayed and disclosed that she was sexually abused as a child. And so that this has triggered much of that victimization. And then she was also a victim of burglary. So you'll add 1 for adult sexual assault, 1 for adult sexually abused or assaulted as a child, and then 1 for burglary. And so as we go through, these are the victim crime types. So not specifically for Rose, but these would be the victim crime types that you would be reporting on, and we'll go through those slides a little bit later. But we just want to tell the story about Rose and what happened to her. Rose is a fictitious character, by the way, that we just made up for purposes of this webinar. And so the next category is really understanding special classification of individuals. So these are individuals who may have been kind of in that outlier area, but maybe specifics that we may not have the capacity to serve, but understand that they have special needs that are requiring maybe some we currently do not provide. So again, this is all self-disclosure at the victim. This would not be anything that we would be specifically asking unless there's a specific reason to ask that information. So under this specific, we have identified that Rose is homeless, and she was recently evicted from her apartment. And so she, at the time when she was assaulted at the casino, was homeless and was maybe oftentimes sleeping in her vehicle. And so this may have, made her more vulnerable in terms of her victimization that she had incurred. During the burglary that occurred, she was also assaulted and had experienced post-traumatic stress disorder due to her child victimization. But at some point in her life, she had been physically assaulted, and she suffered from symptoms of traumatic brain injury. And so we just use this kind of scenario for this category for victims with disabilities, either cognitive, physical, or mental, because we understand that victims of strangulation, victims of traumatic brain injury often display later, farther down, the line up to 10 years of their initial victimization. And so we've marked in this category that she was a victim with disability, either cognitive, physical, or mental, and in this case it was cognitive. And so you'll see the other categories within this, which would include anything with limited English proficiency. There's a space for other, or if there's a high population close to your reservation community that maybe serves either homeless populations, LGBTQ, high population of veterans, you would, again, mark these categories. So the next specific set of, yes.
Sorry to interrupt. We have a couple questions. And the first is, so in the example that you're giving, you're talking a lot about some of Rose's past experiences. And so the question was, for the information, and please feel free for the person who asked, if I get your question wrong or add some detail that's not correct, please help me out. So the question is, as they're completing, if they decide to use this template, as they're filling it out, should they be filling it out based off the issues or the services that are being provided for the victim based on their current experiences, or including historic issues?
It should be for any services that the victim discloses. So for when we work with victims, it's a very complex understanding of how a current victimization can trigger past victimizations. And so you'll often see that there may be health-related issues, either depression, insomnia, by being triggered through a current sexual assault. That may trigger nightmares, insomnia, maybe for a traumatic brain injury that has occurred previous. You'll see forgetfulness, maybe not understanding, kind of short-term memory loss, long-term memory loss, as a result of that trigger of a current victimization. And so it's really what the victim is displaying, what she or he is sharing with you. Again, we're not therapists, we're advocates. And so we're there to understand the full expressed sovereignty and needs that the victim is requesting. And so if you have a victim who's disclosed, that she is now triggered, she can't sleep alone, she's homeless, whatever that disclosure is, we're counting and understanding a full picture, a full story of a victim, because it's not just one victimization. It could trigger multiple. It's not just one service. We are offering, separate services, and that can include court accompaniment to counseling. So really telling as much of a story as you can for a victim.
Great, thank you. And then I have another question. What date did our first reporting period start? Great question, and that would be October 1st. And so if you see in the template that was that we've been looking at, those tabs at the bottom, the quarters follow the federal fiscal year, and so quarter one is October to December, and so your report covers that period. And Kelly, I don't know if you have more that you want to add now or later in terms of for if they haven't gotten their LOA yet, for example, and so haven't actually started the program, they should wait. Their numbers would begin when they sign their LOA. Is that accurate, either Kelly or Lana?
Yes, this is Kelly. Yeah. So when you sign your LOA, is when when you would start counting for victims served against this particular grant opportunity. And as she mentioned, we'll go through this a little bit later on. The first quarter is going to be through the end of December, and you'll submit that report in January, and we'll give you a little bit of information about when that needs to be submitted by. We'll do that later on in the webinar.
Okay, and I do have another question. So if you reported in this example for Rose, historic information in question one, are you then repeating, quarter one. If you reported this information in the first quarter, are you then repeating this information for quarter two, knowing that this information would still exist going through time? Would this skew the data when taking into account all the quarters? And I'll take the first kind of stab at that question. Is that for each quarter, you're only reporting on the individuals served during that quarter. So if Rose appears in quarter one requesting services and she does not appear in quarter two, you don't report any information for her. If she then comes back a couple months later in quarter three with similar requesting similar services, then you would report it based on, that the services provided within that quarter. And Lana, please feel free to add more to that or help clarify.
No, that's absolutely correct. So I'm just being aware of the time. So Abby, if you can go back to the slide deck, I think we've displayed at least enough of the sample, and I will pull through some of the remaining of Rose's story as we cover some of the additional information. But if we go back to the slide deck, I just want to make sure that we're getting to the reporting information. So if you go to the next slide, which is also the requirement, the dates as well. Next slide.
I can go ahead and jump in on here. When you fill out the report at the end of the reporting period for the quarter, the way we've set it up is that you're going to be able to let the system know if you track new individuals or not. Again, the first quarter, everybody is new, so you will always say yes for that. But we recognize that based on your system, you may not be tracking new versus returning individuals. And so if you're not doing that, you will be able to answer no. If you say no, then certain questions will not be asked around demographics and things like that. If you answer yes, then those questions will be asked, but you'll only answer those questions as they relate to your new individuals. This is kind of to the point that the last individual is making on the question, that this is so as not to duplicate information, where you're really only being asked about specifics on new individuals. One thing that I wanted to make a note of is that when you are going into any of the demographic information or even the services, there's always an option to say that that the information is not reported. So it's not a requirement. If somebody doesn't want to, as Lana was saying, this is all self-disclosed information. So there is going to be throughout the process an opportunity for you to indicate that that information was not shared. So you should not feel that you have to pressure any individual to provide information for you just for the purposes of reporting. Lana, did you want to talk a little bit about the confidentiality piece?
Sure. Just again, to the point that we are understanding that whatever process that we're setting up for the internal, that this again does not connect that in any way to the victim. So again, coming up with a process internally that is allowing for the information and stories and demographic, qualitative, quantitative, all of the information that we are requesting, internal control process that you're setting up, again, not be connected to an individual or a victim's name or personal identifying information, and to keep that separate.
Great. Can we go to the next slide? So at this point, the system will ask you, of the number of individuals that you answered in question 1, so that question was how many total individuals did you serve during the reporting period, how many were new? We've pretty much spoken to this point quite a bit, so I think we can go into the next slide. Then you're going to be asked about the population demographics. Again, if you do not track the demographic data, if you do not track this information, there is going to be a way in the online reporting system for you to indicate that that information is not being tracked, so that you do not have to enter it. So we don't want anybody to be overly stressed by the assumption that you have to get this up and running by tomorrow or anything like that. There is an opportunity for you to indicate that that information is not tracked, or that that information was not provided by any individual that did not want to provide that information. As I noted, the question 5 will be based on the number of new individuals that are in the reporting period. So as we were noting before, once you get past the first reporting period, the demographic and all that information that you're providing is only for new individuals. Next slide. Lana, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Kelly. So when we talk about the types of victimization, again, if we go back to Rose, we won't go back to the actual template, but again, if we're talking about Rose and the victimization that she had incurred, so she was a victim of sexual assault, she was a victim of burglary, as well as she was an adult child, a sexual abuse survivor. And so those are the questions that would be asked in the types of victimization. Classification, again, is the LGBTQ, veterans, any type of special classification. And then direct services, which we did not cover on the template, but you can go back and look at that on your own time. But we wanted to kind of just highlight a few of the options that you would be able to check. So next slide. So again, these are the types of victimization. So your program may only be serving one of these populations. But again, when we're working with victims, just understanding that they are very, may have compound complex trauma. And so understanding that it's not as cut and dry as you know, suffering victimization without possibly triggering other types of victimization that may have occurred throughout the victim's lifetime. And so we won't go through each one of these, but you can see that there are types of victimizations that may be correlated to another type of victimization. And so understanding that you can check as many boxes as you need to for an individual. And if the type of victimization is unknown, say you talk to an individual on an anonymous line, and they were, you know, maybe in a really hard way, and just wanting someone to talk to and maybe not disclose the type of victimization, you would just check that other, and then have an opportunity to explain. Next slide. So again, this is that special classification, and we chose to display victims with disabilities only because I think the other categories are pretty self-explanatory, but understanding that a victim may have a past trauma that had been triggered. In this case, it was a traumatic brain injury. Next slide. And this is under direct services, so we won't go back to the specific sample, but you can go through and look on your own. So this is the direct services. Was the individual assisted with a victim compensation application during the reporting period? Next slide. So when we work with the Office of Victims of Crime, who actually administer the VOCA funds that actually provide compensation for victims of crime who may have suffered, you know, a crime that was reported, and say that they're seeking, you know, funds for counseling at this time, that this is an opportunity to really seek compensation. And this is tied to victim rights, not just victim rights possibly for your tribal community, but state victim crime rights as well as federal victim crime rights. And we can have more discussion on this. If you don't already have a relationship with your state administrating agency, this is another way for a victim to receive compensation for any injuries that she may or he may have suffered as a result of the crime. And again, this is to return them to whole. And knowing that, you know, we're not always going to be returned to whole, but at least through some compensation, we can at least arrive at some form of healing. So this also asks, what type of services did your community program, shelter, ICW program. What type of services did you provide during this reporting period? Next slide. So when we think about the information and referral, so information, what information did you provide that victim? What information did you provide that victim about victim rights? And we can talk a little bit more about this in another webinar in terms of victim rights and how to they gain access to that information about compensation, as well as a right to be heard in court, a right to a speedy trial, a right to understand if that person is being released from prison, jail, all of the above. And then what other types of services did you refer the victim to? So maybe there's an equine program, therapy program in your tribal community, and you're working with children who have been sexually abused. Maybe there was a referral to that program. Referral to other services, which could be civil legal matters, medical, faith-based, address, confidentiality, which pertains to maybe a safe at home program where your whereabouts and location can be secured. And this will also require the number of times each service was provided during the reporting period. So if you gave information to Rose about individual counseling, you referred her to individual counseling, and then Rose comes back 2 quarters later and needs another referral, say for financial assistance regarding her eviction, and writing a letter to her landlord. Next slide. So the other is personal accompaniment. So what information you provided the victim in the previous, but also what personal advocacy or accompaniment. So this could include accompanying Rose to a sexual assault medical exam. This could include giving her information and intervening with her landlord so that the landlord understands her circumstances and maybe why she was unable to pay her rent at that time. It could include transportation assistance. So any number of these services, and again, you would report it per quarter. So Rose may utilize 3 of these services in the first quarter and then come back in the third quarter and only utilize 1 of those services. Next slide. So the other is emotional support and safety. So we want to understand how you're supporting that victim. If your program does not provide any of these emotional support or safety services, this is you would only report where you referred the victim to. However, if your program is providing crisis intervention, support groups for victims of crime, maybe you're offering emergency financial assistance such as gift cards, emergency loans for an eviction and to pay first and last month's rent. Perhaps you have equine therapy or you have other types of cultural activities that victims of crime can benefit, whether it's spiritual services with a trusted spiritual leader. Again, these are services that your program provides, not who you referred the victim to, right? So that would be a referral. This is only the programs and services that your specific program provides through this fund. Next slide. So shelter and housing, one of the kind of primary understanding and understanding how we count shelters, emergency services, safe houses, transitional housing. This may also include, hotel stays as emergency shelter, relocation assistance, so assistance obtaining housing. Please count the number of nights that individual stayed. Say you don't have a shelter in your tribal community, but you have a casino. And so you put up Rose for one night because she was going to go stay with a relative after that. So the night of her sexual assault, you put her up at the casino. You would only count that as one night in that grant reporting period. But say the next quarter or two, the next quarter she is finding that it's difficult to stay with family, and so she needs to come back and spend another 6 nights at the casino. So for quarter 2, you're going to report 6 nights rather than one person, so that we're painting a picture of how many nights of shelter, emergency shelter, as well as transitional housing, are we providing victims in Indian country? Next slide. This is any services that were assisted through the criminal civil justice system. So notification. So again, this triggers any type of victim rights. So this would be notification of a case status, arrest, court proceedings, a release from jail, a victim impact assistance, anything pertaining to or understanding restitution. That would be victim compensation, again, through the state administrating agency in your state. And then the next few bullet points have to do with civil legal assistance. So does your tribe administer tribal protection orders? Or if not, are you assisting her and accompanying her in filling out a county tribal or a county protection order? And then any civil legal assistance with family law issues. So these may pertain to custody, visitation, child support, withholding child support. And then this would include any other emergency justice related assistance. And so this may be filling out a form for victims compensation as an example. If you work with immigration at all, that there's an opportunity for you to provide that information. Maybe some folks who work close to borders, either north or south, prosecution, interview, advocacy, and accompaniment. So this may be an opportunity for you to accompany her to any type of interview that she may have to incur, which would be prosecution, law enforcement, any type of accompaniment that you provide. And we included a specific note on the bottom for those of you folks who are doing the child forensic exams. So for this specific example, you would include reporting under 3 of these categories. So prosecution interview. So a forensic exam, child forensic exam is a prosecution interview, as well as law enforcement interview, advocacy and accompaniment, as well as criminal advocacy accompaniment. So a child forensic exam would include 3 of those categories. Next slide. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kelly.
Thank you. So there are certain questions that the Office for Victims of Crimes asks that you provide information on an annual basis. And for their purposes, annual means the federal fiscal calendar that runs from October 1st through September 30th. There are about 3 of those questions that are included in the template that is we're looking at, but there is also some other questions. So we'll go on to the next slide and I'll walk you through all of those questions. These questions actually are questions that we're going to ask on a quarterly basis, and this is to help NCAI Fund, TLPI, and First Pick understand how your program is going, and see if there's any additional support that we may be able to provide, and then also to just be able to, as Lana explained in the beginning, better tell the story of what you are doing for your tribe and for your communities in terms of the programming. So there's going to be a short question asking you to describe the ongoing successes of your program, to share any challenges or barriers that you're facing that you did not anticipate. And again, this is not in any way punitive. The information is purely just going to be informational for us to see if there's any way that we can help you to meet those challenges in any other way. A couple questions that we'll be asking from a training and technical assistance perspective, including what additional topics you would like to receive training or technical assistance on, and what additional information, resources, or tools could your program benefit from. And then just understanding the preferred method of technical assistance and delivery. We are going to be asking this on an ongoing basis because we recognize that in today's world, things are changing for people based on what is available to them. And so we want to make sure that we're just keeping aware of whether or not webinars, in-person trainings, peer-to-peer, what is the most effective for you all as the program moves forward. One of the questions that we're going to be asking on a quarterly basis is to understand if you feel that you are fiscally and programmatically on track to complete your program as it was outlined in your grant application. Again, this is informational for us to understand where you are, how you feel you're doing. In most cases, the opportunity here is for us to work with you all to adjust your program or adjust your budget to make sure that you can meet the fiscal and programmatic requirements before the end of the grant. In most cases, unless you feel that there's not a possibility to spend out all the money awarded, we would look with you to find out if there were, additional services that could be provided or something like that if you found that there was more money than was needed because maybe you hired somebody later than you expected or something didn't cost as much as you expected. And we just want to give you plenty of time to do an update to your budget or to adjust your project scope so that you can get everything done that you would like to do before the end of the project. One question that we're curious about is the challenges or barriers that have been facing victims of crime during the time of COVID or natural disasters that your community may be experiencing. And then also if there's any issues that are out of the scope of the current funding stream that are of need for your community. Those will be optional questions, but again, kind of just informational to help us better explain the entire story of what the situation is for victims in your communities and the challenges that you may be having in trying to address the needs that they have. Next slide. So these are the specific questions that are going to be asked only on an annual basis. So based on the timeline of our grant, you will receive these questions twice during the course of the grant. They will span the time period of October 1st to September 30th. And so you'll be answering them in your October report that you submit. One of the questions has to do with any services that you were not able to meet because of organizational capacity issues. They are asking for the number of times that occurred and then an explanation of what the capacity issues might have been that prevented you from being able to provide those services. Also looking to understand the services that victims needed that you could not provide. What are the challenges that prevented you from providing those services? There'll be a question to understand whether or not you formally survey your clients for feedback. If you do, there'll be a couple questions around the number of surveys that you distributed and the number of surveys that were completed. We will not ask you to submit the survey information though. Just curious about the number of folks who were surveyed and completed the survey. And then if there were any challenges that you faced during the course of the federal fiscal year. So you'll notice that we asked that question previously on a quarterly basis, but then here we'll just be asking you to think back through the entire year and indicate if there were any overall challenges that you faced that you'd like to inform us of. Next slide. Then we're going to ask you on the annual report to describe your project. I know that might sound a little bit weird because you would think that we, know your project from your application and such. But there is going to be value, especially because these are going to be done after every 12 months, for you to kind of give the short, brief overview of what you're working on, what your project looks like, where you are. So this is a space for you to kind of just provide a visual of what is going on with your program, what the project actually looks like, because it may be very different from what you put in your application. It may, have become more complex or more simplistic or whatever it might be, that there may be value in being able to describe it on an annual basis. And then understanding the changes that you've seen in these projects began, so that you can speak to not only how the project may have changed over the year, but also the impact that change may have had over on the community. Next slide. So these are the reporting periods that we were speaking to. You'll see that the first report is due January 8th. The reporting period, and if you look at, when you get your LOA, it actually outlines the actual dates of the program period, or the reporting period. But again, the periods match the federal fiscal year quarters. So October through December is our first program period, and you will submit your first report on January 8th of 2021. Then the next program period will run from January through the end of March, and you'll submit that report on April 9th, and so on and so forth. Next slide. I'm going to hand it back over to Lana.
Thank you, Kelly. So we are just going to wrap up this portion of the webinar, but we wanted to tell you a little bit about upcoming webinars briefly before we open it up for questions. So this is upcoming webinars that have to do with very specific maybe items for grantees who are working on community needs assessments and privacy certificates. So those are for the grantees who will be completing a needs assessment with this fund coming up on November 17th. December 1st will be an open webinar for all grantees, sub-grantees for tribal codes for victim services. Again, the repeat to November 17th is a follow-up webinar regarding privacy certificates and community needs assessments. And again, this is only for sub-grantees who are completing a needs assessment with this fund. We also have a repeat of the, I believe the financial, or is this the new? I believe it is a repeat for the financial online reporting webinar, and that will be on December 8th. And then for the sub-grantees who are working on strategic planning, we will have a webinar for you on December 15th. But again, we will be reaching out to all of the grantees, but specifically to those grantees who have brand new programs, and reaching out to you individually to understand your technical assistance needs, as well as First Pick will be working directly with you folks. So we are always available at any time, so you can send us an email, and I'll turn it back over to Esther.
And I believe, Abby, are you going to handle this? Because I think Esther had to get off at 2. If not, we can
Abby?
go ahead and, are there, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to, there's a couple questions about the reporting period. I think you touched on this, Kelly, but just to make sure, what date did our first reporting period start? And then what is the expected date to receive an LOA?
The first question, the reporting period started either October 1st or when you get your LOA, you sign your LOA. The expected date to receive your LOA really has to do with the approval of your budget. There's a 3-step approval process for your budget. So once your budget has reached the final level of approval, then you will get an email letting you know that an LOA is going to be sent. Just as a reminder, the LOAs are sent as like an electronic signature document. So if you get the email email indicating that you should be receiving an LOA and you haven't seen one, please reach out to microgrants@ncai.org and let them know so that they can resend it to you or identify if it maybe hit a firewall or something like that. But it should happen really depending on when your budget is approved. Are there any other questions?
Just one more. Can you provide a list of the state and federal victim compensation contacts?
This is Lana. Yes, we can provide that information and we can send it either Abby, who works for our program at Tribal Law and Policy Institute, or NCAI can send out a chart that lists all of the states that administrating agencies and contacts for victim compensation in your specific state.
Great, thank you, Lana. That is it for questions today.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. We'll leave the contact information up on the screen for a little bit. If you want to put any of this down, again, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. We're always here to help. Or just as a reminder, we are going to be having another webinar closer to the January 8th date when you will be entering your data into the report. So we don't want you to get overwhelmed by the amount of information that was provided today. As Lana mentioned at the beginning, this is to help you understand what information is going to be asked of you, but we will be providing more support when you get closer to completing a report on exactly how to do that. But still, if you have any questions about what was said today, please reach out and don't hesitate to contact us. Lana, did you have anything else before we close out?
Nope, other than I just wanted to thank everybody for your time and attention today. Again, this webinar will be recorded and posted on our website at www.tribalvictimprograms, or maybe someone can help me, tribalvictimservices.org.
Yeah, Tribal Victim Services.
So you can watch this again, or for folks who we can send it out as well for other folks within your program.